So welcome once more time, everybody. Again, my name is Thomas Kessler. I'm the Executive Director of the History Center of San Luis Obispo County. Um, I feel like every conversation that everybody has includes at some point the phrase "in these strange times," but it's really been helpful for us that the public is really at large becoming actively aware of the fact that we're living through history. In a way that maybe in the before times we weren't so actively aware that historians in the future are really going to want to know about what we're going through today. So that's why I think it's so important for us as a history center, as a historical organization here in San Luis Obispo County to exist. And so that's why I am so incredibly proud that all of you guys tonight are interested in joining us for what is going to be an incredibly interesting discussion, conversation. Before we get too far, one of our big projects has been to find ways to stay relevant, even though our museum is closed and you can't come and visit. So we have lots of events, both passive, virtual, and socially distant happening. So I encourage you to visit our website, historycenterslo.org. I encourage you to follow us on social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are History SLO on all three of those platforms. And we are constantly trying to share the wonderful stories that we have in this county. There's really some phenomenal history. So we have a real treat for you tonight. We have two people who really almost don't need an introduction. I will give you just the very briefest. First of all, we are thrilled to have Dan Krieger joining us tonight. Dan is a professor emeritus at Cal Poly in the history department. It's almost easier to say the things that Dan hasn't done than to try to make any attempt to list his accomplishments. But some of them do include his regular Times Past column in the Tribune since 1983, several books on local history. He serves in consulting roles for the mission. He has served as the president of the California Mission Studies Association. He also works with the Salinan tribe to collect that history as well. So we're just wonderful. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. Very glad to have you. Our other wonderful esteemed speaker tonight is going to be James Papp, who is a principal with Historicities, which is a consulting firm in San Luis Obispo specializing in architectural history. He served for many years on the City of San Luis Obispo's Cultural Heritage Committee, including as chair. He ran as a first-time candidate for city council in the most recent election, and for a first-time candidate did a remarkable job. And we're just so thrilled to have him here tonight. And so, gentlemen, is there anything else you'd like to highlight about yourselves, introduce yourselves, and I open it to you. A couple of housekeeping notes. I am going to request that everybody stay muted. You are welcome to use the chat box. We'll be keeping an eye on that. And then I'm sure we'll have time at the end for questions. But at this point, Dan, James, please take it away.
Okay, I'm going to start for Dan, and if you can't hear me, wave and look pained rather than happy. And the reason I'm going to start is that I really brush the surface of history. My job is documentation, and Dan is the one who digs deeply with oral histories. We talked before this talk, and every time I mentioned something, he said, but the real story was this. So to give you a brief introduction on Japantown, it was a triumph. I mean, I think we should be, it was a triumph and it was a betrayal. It strikes me that this happened in the period when California was inventing the noir film, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler novels, which was always about the dark underside of the sunny optimism of California. And so Japantown in San Luis Obispo existed for about 20 years. And it was largely the creation of Yoroku Watanabe. And Thomas, could you put on the screen the aerial view of Japantown? This, what Thomas is going to put up was taken in 1951. So there's a little bit more than was actually there during the period of basically 1923 to 42. But you see it's very tiny. It was a couple of acres. And on the very far right is the Pacific Coast Railway Depot. Then you have Higuera, which was also the newly christened US Route 101 running from Mexico to Canada. And then the line of buildings facing Higuera, the center of that is the two-story Pacific Hotel, which we'll hear more about, and all of those Japanese businesses lining the street there. And then behind them, the boarding house, the rooming houses and places where the people who owned the businesses would actually live. And then behind that, on the left side, you see Eto Street. And it wasn't quite so crowded with buildings, again, in 1931 to 41, but these 2 acres are basically Japantown. And if you can do the next slide of Yoroku Watanabe, Thomas, we will see the person who actually invented Japantown. And that will come in a moment. But
sorry, it's going to take just one second.
Yeah, so essentially you have an area that seems to have been mapped out to be industrial transport, the area around that Pacific Coast Railway terminal. And this was an important crossroads for the Japanese community because the highway going south of the Pacific Coast Railway that went down through all the coastal agricultural areas, and then French Street, which connected to Los Osos Valley Road, and out Los Osos Valley Road, you have dozens of Japanese farmers. And the degree to which Japanese, ethnic Japanese farming was so important in this era, in 1941, 42% of the truck farming by acreage in California was Japanese Americans. And that probably underestimates their effect because Japanese farmers were very good at intensive farming, which they had brought over from Japan. This man was one of them. I'm guessing that this is indeed Yoroku Watanabe because this is the interior of his store. I've never seen him, so I don't know. But Yoroku Watanabe.
I confirmed that was Hiroko from his son, who was at that time a professor of medicine at UCLA Med School in 1981. I showed him this image and he said, yes, that's my father.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Dan. So this man, between 1923 and 1928, on that block of Higuera, built a hotel, a pool room, a fish market, his grocery store, a couple of restaurants. I mean, it was just a wave of building activity. I've never seen anyone spend so little on the buildings that they built. His hotel, which was 100 feet by 20 feet and had boarding houses and a pool room as well, he paid about half for that as the guy, Emmanuel Firpo next door, paid to build his 5-bedroom house. But he got all of this up, and that is really the beginning of Japantown in that period in the 20s. The next really important thing that happens is the establishment of the Buddhist temple, the Buddhist church. And that was about a quarter of a mile out on French Road, basically where the south on-ramp from the 101 is. And that was a farm that had been bought from the Diocese of Monterey. And ultimately they had 150 members. They had tennis courts, they had a baseball diamond, kendo, the YWBA, I had to get that right, the Young Women's Buddhist Association, a scout troop. And so that was really the cultural heart, but all the businesses were over on Higuera. In 1929, Robert Fukunaga purchased the land under Japantown. Yuroko Watanabe was Issei, was born in Japan, so he could never have ownership. Robert Fukunaga was born in Hawaii, so he was Nisei. He was American born, was a citizen, so he could have ownership. That was a California law, by the way. California had a long history of trying to marginalize and get rid of the Japanese population, as they had of the Chinese population before them.
James, you're touching on an interesting situation. The Fukunagas came to Hawaii to work as adults, but they were in Hawaii in 1898 when Hawaii was annexed by the United States, and they automatically became citizens at that time. So even though they weren't American born, they were American citizens. And so when they came to California, they could buy, sell, and purchase. They could hold title to land, which other of the Issei Japanese born immigrants to America could not do.
Yes. Fukunaga is an amazing business person, amazing story, what I'll get to a bit later, but I just want to, again, skate over the surface and then let Dan in to delve the depths. And Fukunaga remakes Japantown. That photograph you saw, that's his two-story brick building that was remade from Watanabe's one-story wood building, the Clover Hotel. Watanabe built it for $1,600. Fukunaga expanded and made it over for $25,000. And according to the Telegram, spent $50,000 on the rest of the block. So this really became an entry point, a gateway to San Luis Obispo from the 101, which was Higuera. That was before the freeway bypass. Ultimately, then in 1931, Tameji Eto, the father of the vegetable industry, the local vegetable industry out in Los Osos Valley, he subdivides that street on the left as the Nippon Tract, and that is Eto Street. And so this is really glorious Japantown, very small, very rural, but this is Japantown in the 1930s. And in 1942, that is when disaster strikes. And it's not just an economic disaster for the Issei and Nisei. It is a betrayal of all that they believed in about America. And I get very emotional because I think of Yuroko Watanabe's youngest son, whose name was Abraham Lincoln Watanabe. And then you had, after Pearl Harbor, our Colbert Olson, our governor, Earl Warren, our attorney general in California, speaking out about how important it was to protect the Japanese Americans. And within a few weeks, they had turned. They saw the handwriting on the wall. They were going to be running against each other, or anticipated they would, for the governorship. And then they were advocating, particularly Earl Warren, advocating for investigating Japanese property holdings, and then brought all the district attorneys and sheriffs of California together in a conference, and they voted unanimously to ask the federal government to move all alien Japanese, which meant, of course, because Asians could not have citizenship at the time, it was barred to them, American citizenship, to move all of them, which of course would include their children. These were mixed families of Issei and Nisei, 200 miles to the east. And shortly thereafter, that provides the cover for Executive Order 9066, creating the military zones, and Japanese except in internment camps are barred from the entire state of California, half of Oregon and Washington, and southern Arizona. And there were almost 1,000 in San Luis Obispo County. Most of them never returned to this county. Most never returned to the coastal areas after internment. Internment, which lasted 3 to 4 years. But as one of the people who was expelled from here said, Tom Nakaji, it was really more like 10 years because they were put out on the street penniless. Their businesses had been taken. They had, these were people who were middle-aged or elderly by this time and had nothing. So they were a generation that was just shocked, and it came from their children to a large extent to rebuild. And at that, I will turn it over to Dan.
One of the things that attracted me to write about the Japanese American experience starting in the late 1970s was a look at the census, which you just cited the figures, that there were more than 800 Japanese Americans in San Luis Obispo County in the 1940 census. And by the 1950 census, there are only several dozen families representing the Japanese American interest here. What made the difference, of course, was that those who owned land had something to come back to. They barely held on to their land for a variety of reasons, but those who leased land had nothing to come back to. And the community, which had opened itself up to the Japanese Americans in the 1930s, I can't tell you the number of people. I was president of what is now the Museum Association. It was the County Historical Society back then. And I got to talk to people who were at that time 40 and 50 years older than I was. And I was still in my 30s. And they were telling us how they loved to go to the Japanese stores for produce. The very first watermelons ever sold here in San Luis Obispo were sold at Tom Kurakawa's store on Palm Street in San Luis Obispo, beginning in 1919. The very best bananas were available through the Watanabe store, and another store in what we call Japantown, operated by the Filipinos, had slightly older bananas that were great for cooking, and they were a bit cheaper. So a number of needs were met by that particular type of wholesale and retail merchandising. There was a fish market, at least one fish market, always operating in Japantown, and eventually there were several competing fish markets, even a Filipino fish market named the Bataan Fish Market, and they had different types of produce, some focusing more on shellfish, others on what we would call normal fish. And this whole enterprise attracted considerable interest from the community, large community patronage, 4th of July parades in San Luis Obispo, the La Fiesta de las Flores parade, which started in 1925 to support the rehabilitation of the mission following the 1920 fire. And the Japanese associations, the Buddhist associations, all had floats in those parades ringed with American flags. One of the books that my wife and I wrote about 40 years ago has a redrawing image of the Watanabe store at the intersection of French Road and Higuera Street. It was covered with American flags. You see Boy Scout associations, baseball associations, again, all sorts of American imagery. And suddenly in 1941, December 7th, 1941, that all changed. A member of the Eto family, the youngest of the daughters of the Eto family, Grace Eto Shibata, will never forget her last day at San Luis Obispo High School on the morning of Monday, December 8th, 1941, when all of her former friends shunned her. They turned their backs towards her. It was just too much. She came home and she told her father to measure. She told her mother. Her father had been arrested by this time by the FBI, but she told her mother, "I can't go back there." And her older brother, my dear friend and mentor, Masashi Eto, said, "That is right. You cannot go back where you are treated this way." And to a large extent, I am surprised the interest that the Eto family still has in San Luis Obispo. Of course, they owned their land. They owned 200 acres just off Los Osos Valley Road. As you enter the so-called downtown area of Los Osos today, it was just a few stores in those days, but that was held for them. And it was not without a great deal of trying that they kept that land. Had it not been for their friend, insurance broker Ernest Woolmer, they would have lost all of their land. Because as you indicated, Governor Olson, who was then competing with his about-to-be rival in the 1942 election, Earl Warren, who was the Attorney General of the state of California, Olson, a left-leaning Democrat, and Warren, you can't say this today, but a centrist Republican, shall we say. But they both became extremely nasty about the Japanese presence, and they sided with the Farm Bureau here in California, which said, "We want to get the Japanese out." They said this openly in their Farm Bureau literature. "We want to get these people out so there'll be more good land for the rest of us." It was a popular myth, what we call fake news today, that the Japanese had all the good land. That's why their production was so high. And in fact, as you pointed out earlier, Japanese Americans largely got the less good land because they came later. The first Japanese immigration to our county didn't occur till 1902. By that time, almost all the good land had been taken. One of my experiences growing up in Southern California during World War II was to drive along Long Beach Boulevard or Atlantic Boulevard, these very, very long 4-lane highways that stretched from the beach area all the way to Huntington Park and to Pasadena. And you'd see large open spaces of land in between the built-up areas. And almost invariably on those large, now empty open spaces, there was a little shack that obviously once was used for vending vegetables or vending strawberries. My grandfather, with whom I traveled a great deal in those days, would point out this is where we went to a Japanese farmer who raised strawberries. This person had wonderfully fresh eggs along with the best vegetables in the Los Angeles basin. We'd go here for cauliflower. We go here for eggplant, for Japanese style eggplant. All of those industries were now gone. They no longer existed. And since that was leased land, very little of it ever came back. My first encounter with a Japanese American was in kindergarten in the autumn of 1945 when my friend Shiro arrived at the kindergarten and the kids started throwing rocks at him. I was a little bigger than a lot of the other kids, and I had a 11-year older brother who had taught me how to fight. And so I defended Shiro, and I ended up in the principal's office time after time, trying to explain why I was knocking baby teeth out of my classmates' mouths. Well, it just seemed the right thing to do. But I also had a sense of loss. My father had told me what had happened to him in April of 1917 when President Wilson declared war on Germany. And he was standing outside his medical doctor father's office. He had just received for his January birthday a dachshund dog, and kids stormed at him and threw bricks and killed his dog. And there I would be in the principal's office in 1945, weeping about a dog dying, and that's why I was defending Cheryl. She couldn't make head nor tail of it, but that was the tragic story of Japanese Americans everywhere in California. They went from being semi-beloved, the community that never got involved in crime. They kept to themselves, but they were good citizens in every way, and now they were to be rejected. And here in San Luis Obispo, there were a few people who stood up for them. The former mayor of San Luis Obispo, Louis Sinsheimer, was one of those. When Tamashi Eto was arrested by the FBI at his ranch home on the night of December 7th, and we've now investigated this, we found that he was on a pre-existing list of leaders, of elites in the Japanese American community who, whether they'd done anything or not, needed to be arrested so the community would have no leadership should there be any problem. And he was taken away. He was taken down to the Santa Barbara County Jail, and then the family heard that he was going to be coming through San Luis Obispo on a guarded train, and he had been arrested without a warm cloak or a coat or anything. And so they went to Mayor Sinsheimer, former Mayor Sinsheimer, at his store, which is now Giuseppe's restaurant in San Luis Obispo on on Monterey Street. And it was the middle of the night, and they said, could you open up your store and so we could get some clothes for our father and husband who's coming through San Luis on the train. He opened the store and said, take anything you think your father will need. And he went down to the railway station with them to make sure there would be no problem. Unfortunately, Tamashi wasn't on that train, but very few people, Ernest Vollmer, a few other people stood up for the Japanese interest. And in the South County, the Loomis family, the Loomis Feed Company and Loomis Insurance family were defended the interest of the Japanese Americans. And I think the insurance connection, both for Vollmer and for the Loomises, was very important because they had title insurance knowledge, and they could help maintain and prove the title to the land. What Warren, Governor Warren and Attorney General, Governor Olson and Attorney General Warren were trying to prove was that the Japanese had purchased the land under false pretenses, that they often had passed title on to an American-born son who was not yet 21 years of age. And in California, again, you couldn't own property until you were 21 at that time. And these insurance agents were very agile in proving title to the land, and they maintained ownership. The Akeda family in South County are always grateful to the Loomises who watched their land to make sure nothing bad could happen in their absence. The Hayashi family, most noted for two of the greatest surgeons who ever lived in our county, had the same experience. Haru Hayashi said, without these good friends, we would not be here today. And Haru still remembers coming back after the war in 1945 when a prominent gas station owner in Arroyo Grande, who had been, Haru had been one of his best customers, and now he refused to sell gasoline to him. The element of the human condition just goes all through this, and it's the sadness that we witness. And I think most of all, what I'm amazed at is that the Japanese provided essential things to our community. Going back to that first watermelon, why had no one brought watermelon into San Luis Obispo? Well, no one thought it would sell here. You had to, the assumption was that it would be almost a foreign food for most people, because San Luis Obispo was one of those communities with a lot of people who lived here 2 and 3 generations, even in 1920. Would they know what to do with watermelon? Well, Tom Kurokawa saw that as a challenge. His brother in Watsonville had brought watermelon to Watsonville for the first time. Why not try it in San Luis Obispo? That sense of innovation, which we know the Japanese do very well, was something that was essential to the marketing community of San Luis Obispo.
Can I jump in here to expand Dan's notions to a much broader canvas? Because Dan has been talking about the land prejudices and so on. This moment in 1941 after Pearl Harbor came with 40 years of anti-Japanese agitation that had started really in the very early century. Organizations, not just the Asian Exclusion League, not just the Anti-Jap Laundry League, but the Native Sons of the Golden West, the California branch of any organization like the American Federation of Labor, the Farm Bureau, as Dan mentioned, the Grange, specifically in California. They were focused on really three things. One, keeping out Japanese immigration. Two, preventing them from having land. And three, getting rid of birthright citizenship, so the children born here would never be able to get land. Sounds familiar. I mean, the horrible thing is we are on a at least 100-year arc, but longer than that. When the Chinese achieved 9% of California population in the late 19th century, that made California call on Washington to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then shortly after that, Japan allowed out migration. And so we began to get Japanese here. By 1920, the population of California was 2% Japanese. They had about 4% of the cropland and were producing 12% of the crops. So they were extremely successful as farmers, but again, had reclaimed often very marginal land. So you get a series of things like the Japanese, like the alien land law in California that prevented only aliens who were not eligible for citizenship. That meant only Asians, because when the 1790 when the 1790 immigration and naturalization, the 1790 Citizenship and Naturalization Act, that's the date 1790, was passed. It said only free whites could be citizens of the United States. That was amended in 1870 for blacks, and then did not include Asians until 1952, McCarran Walter. So the California law said no one ineligible for citizenship could own land, and that was specifically targeted at Asians and most specifically at the Japanese. That was made more stringent in 1920 by a California referendum. Our referendums rarely end up well, I have to say, when 97-3 was the vote amongst the people of California to strengthen the alien exclusion, the alien land law, so that minor children could not own land. And also to bar short-term leases. 1924, the federal government passes the Asian Exclusion Act, so that now it's just not Chinese anymore, but Japanese as well. And so by 1941, the percentage of Japanese population in California had dropped by 20%. The percentage of the land they owned had dropped by 40%. And yet this narrative of threat had gone on so long and was so deeply ingrained that the first thing that Earl Warren did was say, we have to investigate land ownership. And that then became the wedge to expel Japanese Americans to internment camps. So it was nothing new, and it was something that had been prepared for years and years, for decades and decades.
One of the things that you'll see if you go on the tour this Sunday is Eto Street and the delightful little Eto Park down at the end of that street next to St. Luke's Missionary Baptist Church. That park would not exist if it hadn't been for a family that returned to Japan in 1939 because there were no options left open for them in America, particularly in California. I'm speaking of Kiyoshi, my dear friend Kiyoshi Sakurai, whose father simply could not make a living. He was excluded from farming by limitations on obtaining land. He was excluded from so many jobs by common prejudice. He tried to open his own grocery market in metropolitan Los Angeles basin and couldn't make it. So finally, in desperation, he petitioned the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles and was given a ticket to take his family back to Japan. And so Kiyoshi grew up in a Japanese village during the war, where every time the American B-29s flew over, they didn't bomb anything near the village, but the kids would all stone him. He was Japanese, but he was tainted by the American experience, and he was unaccepted there. Kiyoshi came back to the United States in 1946, and when the decision was made by the San Luis Obispo Monday Rotary Club to create Eto Park in celebration of the street that was once named Eto Street, Jim Brabeck, who was president of the club at that time, Jim was with Farm Supply, called and said, "Do you know anyone who knows anything about designing a Japanese park?" And I knew that Kiyoshi had spoken of his neighbor who did not speak any English, a man who'd retired to a suburban Arroyo Grande, California, but he was the leading park designer in Japan at one time. And so he volunteered. Kiyoshi translated as the Rotary worked putting that park together. But the narrative is fascinating to me. We have the name Eto Street taken from the street in March 1942 by the decision of the San Luis Obispo City Council. And now we have someone who was forced to leave America, coming back and bringing an architect to implement the design of that park, which celebrates the disappeared name, which is now still back on that street.
And the architect's name was Koto Matsubara, and he did the Japanese gardens in Fresno, and he did not speak a word of English. So thanks to Kiyoshi and Mary Tyra, who did the translations, we have a beautiful little park thanks to all their efforts.
And Eto Street, or Brook Street as it is now, is a beautiful street. I have to say that's how I first got interested in this, because it is this really jewel of a street that not only represents the difficulties of Japanese Americans in trying to create something of their own because of the, for instance, Yoroka Watanabe never owned the land that he built Japantown on. It was owned by three sisters who were the daughters of a Prussian immigrant, and they ultimately sold the land to Fukunaga, who could own it. But equally with Tameji Eto, the hoops he had to go through in order to create this contract, and then all seized away. But a friend of mine in San Luis told me her great-grandfather, Andres Herrera, came from Mexico to San Luis Obispo, lived in a chicken coop. The family lived in a chicken coop. They lived in a boxcar. They lived in a tent. And the first house they had was the house of a Japanese American family that had been interned. And they paid $1 a month for rent. It was on French Street. And they walked into town every month to pay their $1. So you get one marginalized community which had, for the land they had, it meant nothing to the white community except that resentment that anger. And you even get that if you've read The Face of the Clam, the happy-go-lucky guys in The Face of the Clam, they're always stealing food from the Issei farmers. And, you know, this is a prank. This, you know, who's made ridiculous by this? It's always the Issei who are, you know, too stuck up, too focused on success. So this was just this theme running through all of the dealings with the Japanese. But then the interesting thing about Japantown is you actually have, before 1942, some Blacks and some Filipinos and some Hispanics living there. And once the Japanese are expelled, this tendency accelerates. So by 1950, this is now the hotel, which has become the Clover Hotel, again, from being the Great Pacific Hotel. The restaurant is run by Wilbur Owens, who's notable family here. The Annabelle's restaurant, Annabelle's Cafe, further on the block. She's from a Black woman from Texas, if I remember correctly. The Sisters Restaurant, notable local Black institution, and the woman who runs it, Alice Harris, is living on the corner of Eto Street. And so a new community is formed. And what's so important about Brook Street as it is now, Eto Street as it was then, is that it is a place where people outside of the mainstream of what we want for society, whether they are Japanese, whether they are Black, or whether they just don't have as much money as everybody else, can live. And for me, one of the shocking things is that back in 1987, I believe it was, the proposal was made that Brook Street be landmarked as a historic district because of this incredible history. And then a mere 15 years later, city planners, being what city planners are, wanting to plan cities, the mid-Higuera plan became to demolish all of Brook Street, put up obviously expensive condominiums to solve what I have referred to as the Great California pied-à-terre crisis, which is we just don't have enough second homes for rich people to spend their weekends in San Luis Obispo in, and to move the church, St. Luke's, so that the city can do, you know, their great redevelopment plans. And this is an area which is not a, you know, which doesn't have the grand houses of Buchon and Leff, which doesn't have some of the characteristics that we like to think of as preserved architectural history, which is usually the preserved architectural history of the overclass. This is something that goes right to the heart of America. And it is, as I said during my campaign, San Luis Obispo used to be much less white. In the future, it's going to be much less white. I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are here, and this is a couple of old white guys giving this talk, to preserve that history for the future, that people in the present have to look to the past and save some of that for the people in the future to understand. The earliest piece of documentation I could find on Eto Street was a birth announcement for the son of Mr. and Mrs. Masayoshi Nakaji. That was Fred Tetsu Nakaji, born in 1935, and was taken to, let's be honest, the concentration camps. They were not relocation camps. They were referred to at the time by people advocating for them as concentration camps. When he got out, the Nakajis all moved from San Luis Obispo up to San Jose, which was the area they had come from, and tried to remake their lives. Fred Nakaji worked for the US Wildlife Service, is now retired. He's still alive. But it's that generation and their struggle that is also part of the quote unquote greatest generation, and that we have a chance in Eto Street to save. And that is the history of the Japanese in this town, the history of African Americans in this town, and the communities that they built, and the triumph that they had in building it, because it was not just tragedy, it was also triumph.
James, I just noticed a note from James Good, is it? Were the Japanese from this area sent to the Manzanar camp primarily? And no, they were not. The only reason we speak of Manzanar so often here, outside of the wonderful book Farewell to Manzanar, is because the Eto family went to Manzanar. And the reason for that is that one of Tamaji Eto's daughters, Toshiko, gone to Mills College and then on to Stanford Nursing School at Presbyterian Hospital in San Francisco, where she graduated at the top of her class. And she was hired as a nurse for the temporary hospital. They called it temporary hospital in 1942. They called it temporary hospital when the camp was closed in 1945. That tells you something about those camps. And I have to say also, I've taken a number of buses of people over to Manzanar and to some of the other camps, and they looked exactly like the German concentration camps from the outside. There were watchtowers, there were with machine guns, with Browning water-cooled machine guns mounted in them. There were searchlights. Within the camp itself, there were Japanese Americans, Nisei young men who were hired as police. But in the Holocaust concentration camps, Jews were hired to be the police force within many of those camps, ironically. And there's a whole controversy about this, but it was the dynamics of the operations of the camps. One of the best descriptors I have is from my friend Haru Hayashi, who said we got out to this camp in the Colorado desert, and we passed over the Colorado River, and it looked like mighty good fishing. And we tried to get down to the river, and we suddenly came to a barbed wire fence, and the guards warning us away from that fence. And we realized then that this was not a holiday. This was serious business. They were in the camps. But the Eto family did go to Manzanar camp, and eventually there were riots in that camp over what we call the no-no movement, young Japanese Americans who refused two conditions. One, that they had to renounce all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, and two, they had to be willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States. We can say, well, why shouldn't someone who is an American citizen renounce all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? That's an easy one. Well, you're an American citizen, and your government, your citizenship affords no protection, and there you are in Manzanar imprisoned. I think it has to be seen in that context. No, I will not serve has to be seen from the standpoint of those who did serve, the heroic service of the members of the 442nd first in Italy, where they were suffering 80 and 90% losses in some of the battles in the Liri Valley, and then they went on into France, and then eventually on into Germany, helping to liberate part of the Dachau concentration camp compounds. And these people really took it hard. But there were also many more Japanese Americans who served in what we call the Military Intelligence Service in the Pacific. They became the eyes and ears for MacArthur's island hopping. You needed people who could translate for you. And many Japanese American young men, some from this county, were taken back to Camp Savage and Fort Snelling in Minnesota and taught the proper way, the Japanese way of pronouncing words, because the Japanese they had learned in the Buddhist church-sponsored language schools was somewhat imperfect. It was, they only had partial exposure. They knew enough Japanese to communicate with their parents, often whom only spoke Japanese, but they did not know the formal Japanese necessary to interrogate a senior Japanese officer and such. And so they were right at the front lines in these desert island campaigns and the jungle forest on some of those islands, which was very, very difficult for them to do. And so there were these riots at Manzanar, and the no-nos thought they had been sold out by some of the leadership of their own community. There were several deaths, and the Eto family had to be taken out of that camp and removed to a temporary camp, and guess where? Death Valley, just at the entrance to Death Valley. When you go through is it Stovepipe Wells and the entrance to Death Valley, and you'll see the barracks still standing there to this day. And then they sought early release to some of their family who had moved to Idaho and were engaged in sugar beet farming, where their expertise was very much needed because of the great shortage of sugar beets during war, which was used not just for sugar, but for the manufacture of munitions. And so Tamaji Eto, master farmer that he was, and his son Masaji, who was one of the greatest farmers I've ever met, and he's like a father to Jim Brabeck and me. We both spoke at his funeral in the Buddhist temple. They went there and they contributed to the war effort through their farming skills too. So it's a story of heroism. It's a story. Liz and I, my dear wife and I together, she should really be on this broadcast. We've interviewed hundreds of Japanese Americans over the years, and we've learned some of the complex inner histories that you and I, James, were talking about today from people like George Fukunaga, who really opened up to us, largely because we were close, very close. We're sort of adopted members of the Eto family, and George had married the oldest of the Eto daughters, and underneath what appears to be the written record, there are narratives of a people who were as put down as any minority in America has ever been put down, other than the blacks and the Native Americans who were persecuted to death in slavery. But these people were really in bad straits, and they had to find ways of getting around the law. And this is what Colbert Olson and Earl Warren were trying to get at. These people have broken the law. And no, they didn't really break the law. They followed the law to the letter, but they found, like most of Americans, if they're confronted with legal problems, they see an attorney and there's a way around which the specific law is written. And that's all they were doing. They turned to attorneys like Harry J. Dubin, who was trusted by the Japanese community, because he could assist them in making these titles to land, so that even though your name wasn't on the title, you in fact were the owner of the land.
Yeah,
if I could interject for a minute, I just want to piggyback, Dan, on what you said about the 442 and the all Japanese regiments. They had the highest percentage of Congressional Medal honors of our military's history. And Leo Kakuki, Susie Eto Bauman's husband, who's part of the Eto family, was killed on Anzio Beach fighting for this country, while his wife, his daughter, his unborn child, his mother and father and mother-in-law were incarcerated. So when you think about the courage and the dedication of this country, the Nisei are huge parts of that, and we owe them a debt of gratitude.
Yeah, connecting that to the previous question of James Goods. So the Nakaji family that I mentioned briefly, there were 3 brothers in the area. 2 of the families got sent to Arkansas. So you can imagine, 24-hour train ride, and then miles away from anything that they've ever known. And then one of the groups was sent to a different camp in Arkansas when the first camp shut down. Another of the families was sent to Gila River. And from there, their son Calvin, who had been a star athlete in Santa Maria High School, then became a star athlete at the Fresno assembly camp before they were sent out. That was the Fresno Fairgrounds. online you can find all kinds of fabulous things like the newsletters that they published in the camps. He then volunteered for service and joined the army. So this is it's not a unitary thing. It was a complex community, but put in really horrible, horrible circumstances. And
Susie Bauman Eto, who Jim Braybeck was just mentioning, was at the camp in Arkansas when she received word that her husband, she now had 2 children to take care of, and her husband, Leo Kikuchi, had been killed in Italy. And these camps were far flung. And there, Susie had to leave one camp because of threats made to her life.
Yeah. A friend of mine in New York mentioned, an elderly friend of mine mentioned he got a summer job in Idaho when he was a kid building a camp. And he said, "Oh, what's this camp for?" Well, it was an internment camp for the Japanese. So, it leaves one speechless. Yes, there were the circumstances of the time, there was Pearl Harbor and so on, but there was 40 years of anti-Japanese rhetoric that had just, an anti-Asian rhetoric that had just been piled and piled and piled on by politicians, by newspapers, by organizations. In 1910, the California Republican Party, the California Democratic Party, and the California Socialist Party all had anti-Japanese planks in their platform. That's how endemic it was. And, we can't let it happen again. And I'm not talking about internment. I'm talking about, that we're still arguing about citizenship. We're still arguing about immigration in those terms.
I just noticed a tag. I didn't quite get the name. Provincio, Pastor Provincio, is it Gene Sis Provincio, mentioning my dear friend George Aki, who was president of the congregation, was the pastor of the Congregational Church in San Luis Obispo from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. I got to know George very, very well when he was in the retirement community for Presbyterian and Congregationalist ministers down at Claremont College. It's called Pilgrim Place. And my wife's aunt and her husband, both Roman Catholic ministers, retired there. And George told me this one story, which I published, when he came back from serving in the 442nd as a Congregationalist minister. He had been he had been ordained, by the way, at Tanforan Racetrack. He'd been taken out of the Congregationalist Seminary, Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, and taken to this temporary holding center at Tanforan Racetrack, just south of San Francisco. It's where that See's Candy warehouse is now located in South San Francisco. And he, on the day he was to be ordained, it had to be done through the gate of the racetrack. He was living in a stable, and he said, "I smelled a horse, but I went up and they gave God's blessing to me, and I became a minister." And then he was shipped overseas to minister to the many dead and dying in the 442nd. He said, "I did so many funerals and identified so many bodies and such." He got back to Chicago, and he went into the AAA office to get automobile insurance for his car. And the AAA person there told him, "Oh, we don't serve Japanese Americans here." That prejudice had gone all the way to the Midwest. And I did not know that, but George was a beautiful person. In retirement, he took care of almost everyone's garden. There are about 175, 200 residences in Pilgrim Place, and he took care of all of those who had gardens where they lived.
We should probably ask if, Dan and I are both talkers, we should ask if there are questions, if there are comments. We You know, we're both, I often say of Dan, I quote Oliver Goldsmith's line, and still they gazed and still their wonder grew that one small head could carry all he knew. But we will both be writing for La Vista, articles based on what we've been talking about tonight. Is there anyone out there who has recollections, who has questions, who has anything?
Oh, this is Jim Brabeck, and I would like to thank Dan. He's very quick to give credit to other people, but without Dan, we probably wouldn't have Eto Park. And back to the whole Japanese community, their culture, the grace, the dedication to our country, their values, 442, and all the sacrifices that were made. But prior to World War II, as you mentioned, Mr. Papp, Eto Street was Eto Street. Mayor Doonan, back in the 80s, was our mayor. He'd been a resistance fighter. He wanted to name the street back to Eto Street. It was renamed Brook Street right after December 7th, after the start of the war. And the votes on the city council were to name it to go back to Eto Street. All the votes were there. And Masaji Eto himself said, no, we're not going to change the name of that street back to Eto Street. The people on that street know it as Brook Street, so leave it alone. And so that's why it remains Brook Street today, is because Masaji himself said he did not want to force anybody to do anything because they knew what it felt like to be forced to do something. And I thought that showed a lot of class. The other thing I think that's really important is with the building of Eto Park to memorialize the Japanese community, it was really a community effort. We had with Dan, the Polish Slavic lead, on the committee to honor those who made a difference, the Buddhist community, the Rotary Club of San Luis Obispo, this Irish German Catholic, Koto Matsubara, Tira and Kiyoshi Sakurai, to put that all together to build that park. And everything in that park was donated. Everybody contributed. All the permits that we had to go through, the Parks Commission, Planning Commission, City Council, all unanimous. And I think it shows what can happen when we work together in Rotaries and organization as dedicated to world understanding and peace. And we were the catalyst to put this together. But what really humbled me was when we're building that park, two things. Mary Tira, whose husband had been a physician at Manzanar, Susie Eto Bauman came by to see how we're doing, and I introduced them. And Susie said, Tira, that name sounds familiar, and was your husband a physician? And she said, yes. Mary said, yes. And she says, your husband is the one in the camp that delivered my second son. That gave me goosebumps. That was really powerful. The second thing, back to the city and all the bureaucracy, the permits, the cost of doing anything, after all those processes, and we got all finished, I went down to pull the building permit, and the planning director comes out and he says, Jim, we're gonna pay our, we went to pay our fees. He says, Jim, there are no fees, just go build your park. That's the only project in the history of San Luis Obispo who's ever been built without a permit and didn't cost a penny from everybody in the community to make it happen in memorial of the Japanese community. And if you go to Eto Park on Saturday or Sunday, take a look at that little park. That piece of granite and the poem is there from Grace Eto is just a very beautiful testimony to what we tried to do to recognize the sacrifices this great community did to build our county and this nation. So thank you.
I'd like to mention growing up as a child in Hidden Valley, there was a family, the Mura family, who had been interred in, I think, in one of the camps in Denver. And they had 3 little girls in the family who were the same age as the 3 little girls in our family. And we all became best friends. And they were such graceful, elegant people. We learned manners and a little bit of grace from them. They were just so amazing. And because, you know, they and my parents were, you know, good friends, they talked about some of the things that they had endured at the camp in a very matter-of-fact way. But, you know, it was pretty awful. It was pretty primitive. And yet they returned to their elegant way of life, unbowed, forgiving, and integrated in this calm, matter-of-fact way. And so there were several years that they were neighbors. And then they found a little house in Pismo Beach that they wanted to buy. And we were just astounded that they had such difficulty buying this house because all of the neighbors in Pismo Beach were just did not want a Japanese family in their midst. As soon as they heard about this, they were all upset and trying to block it. And the Muras were just very calm. They just said, well, you know, they're really legally, there won't be a problem. And they'll come to understand. And they accepted the fact that these people were ignorant, but sure enough, the neighbors came around and of course ended up loving them. But the approach that they had was just so marvelous. And I think we need to recognize that. And the mother even said one time, we have to remember that not only was there prejudice, but we just looked at it in some ways we were being protected because so many people in California and the country didn't understand what was going on. And so in a way, even though it was terrible circumstances, we were protected during those years, which, you know, my family was, how could they feel that way? But that is the way that they were. And that culture, I think we need to recognize that there are not too many cultures that would have endured such indignity with the dignity that they displayed.
The motto or the favorite saying of almost all of the Issei and Nisei translates in English to, it cannot be helped. What is happening cannot be helped. And that says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you know, Dan, not only that, but of all the interactions with all my 52 years at Farm Supply, the Japanese community, and Masaji, who was one of my mentors, as you know, and I loved him dearly. The one thing in all the traveling I've done with Masaji, not one word of bitterness from anybody within the Japanese community, which I just think it's inspiring to me to try to be a better person. There's no bitterness, zero. They just move into the future and go forward, not backwards.
Man.
Well, I'm hoping as we move into the future that we do preserve the past, and that I am trying to raise interest in getting Eto Street to be indeed landmarked as a historic district. If you do walk around it, you'll see that much of the way it looked, and it really is Eto Brook Street, because much of the way it looked, there are buildings from the Japanese period, there are buildings from the African American period, and we're at a moment when, frankly, preservationists, it is popular to paint preservationists with old fogies, but the reality is you cannot build affordable housing in California anymore. So you are left with preserving the housing that is there. And that is still an affordable neighborhood. I was really inspired. I stopped there yesterday and got to talking to someone who owns the lot that was converted into a car shop, a mechanic shop, and he's converting it back into a house. And he had to go through many, many hoops with the city to do that, because the city was saying, oh no, this is now commercial. This is now residential commercial, CR. So, but you know, there is no reason to take these few and very evocative areas, which are also still affordable, and turn them into another condominium complex and forget this. This is all that's left of Japantown. The rest of Japantown is now a Jiffy Lube and a strip mall and a parking lot. And if that's good city planning, if you think that's good city planning, don't vote for me the next time I run, because I think that's ridiculous city planning. What was once the centerpiece of the Japanese community, that glorious Pacific Hotel with its fall stitch brick, the many complicated land ownership and property ownership things that people had to overcome, and now it's nothing at all. So Eto Brook Street must be saved for the people of the future as much as for the people of the past.
One thing I'd like to ask Mr. Papp is, within the Lower Higuera Street master plan, Eto Park is definitely there, and they have plans to develop the lower end of Higuera Street at some point when Caltrans moves out to where the Octagon Barn is. Behind that, the property's been purchased. The only thing I would respectfully ask, and this is in honor of Masaji Eto, is you not push anything forward to change the street back to Eto Street. That would be offensive to him. Those are his words, and I would like to honor his memory by not doing that.
No, and in fact, recently a successful city council candidate contacted me about changing the name to Eto Street, and I explained what had happened. Essentially, when that proposal was made, and Dan can speak to this because he was there, the Black community or members of it objected because they, by that point, identified with the Brook Street name. So it is really both. It is Eto Street and it is Brook Street. Both communities can be remembered. Communities, you know, I spent the summer protesting with Black Lives Matter. And at one point I mentioned that when people were complaining about Black Lives Matter going on the freeway, I said, you know, why the freeway is there? Because that was the barrio. And they had the choice of running the three-way through the barrio or through the restricted neighborhood of Anholm, which was no Blacks and no Asians. Of course, they chose the barrio. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Jim.
Please don't do that. And secondly, to give you some more history about Eto Street, when we wanted to honor the Eto family, that was one of the suggestions, was we do something there on the street to name it back to Eto Street. And Dan and I explained to them why they didn't want to do that, because to honor Masaji Eto's memory and his wishes. But they were going to put a plaque in front of the Japanese, just a plaque in front of that Japanese Automotive Center. Took a look at that and I said, no, that's disgraceful. We're not going to do that. Mr. Miller was there, and there was an abandoned park across the street next to the St. Luke's Baptist Church that the church had been using for parking. And he suggested, why don't we do a park? And it was abandoned. So that's where it started to come up. Still abandoned. Park, and it was pretty cool. So we went to St. Luke's Baptist Church, spoke to the minister, Theo Dunn, by the way, who's a legend in this community, African-American, a Hall of Famer at Cal Poly. He was instrumental in getting the church to support what we're doing. And so they basically had been using that abandoned park for parking for the church, but this meant more to them than to have parking. So now we have Eto Park. So this has really been something to be proud of. And it's just a little piece of oasis in our community to show what can be done when people work together as one.
Naomi and David Blakely just flashed the question, who was Brook of Brook Street? And I investigated this, Liz and I investigated this very carefully with many living council people who had been on the council when that change was made. And they thought, based on staff planning recommendations, it should be.
I'm trying to figure out how to respond. I'm new on Zoom. And
they thought that it was named Brook simply because it's next to the creek.
I think you're right, Dan.
Okay, it looks like Sabrina, you are trying to ask a question. We can hear you if you want to go ahead.
I know, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, well, all right. I wanted to address what we're talking about here, and hello, Jim Brabeck. My concern, I own property on Brook Street. I own 175 Brook Street. And it's the condition of Eto Park. It has been going on for years that the city no longer maintains it. And I know I personally have gone over and watered and tried to help with the park. And it breaks my heart that the city thinks it's not worth maintaining. I don't know how to probably get a group together here and we could put some pressure on to get the city to maintain parks and recs, to maintain the park. It's very valuable. And when I purchased my house there in 1988, I knew it was a special street. And if anybody wants to come in and develop it, they'll have to fight me first.
Hey,
Well, Mrs. Ross,
That's all I have to say.
I appreciate everything, and back to the neighbors letting us do that. When we started the project, we did speak to many of the neighbors, but we asked the city just three things. Number one, they let us take that abandoned park and make it into a park, abandoned park, made it into Eto Park. Secondly, that we name it Eto Park. That was the second condition, in honor of the Eto family. And thirdly, that the city would maintain the park, and they agreed to do that. And with the city and economic downturns, they have some challenges everywhere financially, but I think we need to revisit that with the city, because they're going to, they agreed to maintain it. And Koto Matsubaru's exact comments when we finished that park was he called that park like the Emperor's Clothes. I think there's something like 160 different types of plants in that park, and they'd agreed to maintain it. So we just need to revisit that with the city.
Absolutely, because it's not being maintained, and there's not, probably half of those plants are dead.
Well, thank you for letting me know that. I haven't been by there in a while, but we'll get on it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. And I want to thank everybody who's been participating here. I wanted to mention, somebody had asked about the walking tours. I wanted to make sure people knew that we're not holding any walking tours now, in part because of the COVID crisis. By the way, I'm John Ashbaugh, and I'm president of the board of the History Center. And we initially have put together the barbecue that's occurring on Sunday at Via Automotive at the invitation of John Villa, who was on our board. And when that suggestion came up, it also occurred to many of us that, well, let's take advantage of bringing people in there to make sure they knew about this neighborhood. Now, because of COVID, we can't actually hold walking tours there, but what we are doing is going to hand out a little document. I'm showing it for those of you who can see it right now. It's going to be a self-guided walking tour to the Eto Brook Street neighborhood. It's only a few pages, and we're going to be printing it tomorrow. We still have some corrections to make. We have pictures of the, for example, in St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church, and of this wonderful mural that faces the south side of Eto Park that was created in 2002 called Old-Fashioned Baptism. And we'll call attention not only to the Japanese American legacy that remains there, as well as the African American experience. And it's still so well represented at St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church, one of only two predominantly Black churches in San Luis Obispo. So we ask people, if you want to get a copy of this, it's best to have already bought one of our barbecues. We're, I think, pretty well sold out now. Thomas.
Yeah, John, the barbecue is totally sold out. We'll be posting a PDF of this document on our website in the next few days. So just as I mentioned at the beginning, we have lots of things going on. Check our website, historycenterslo.org, and you'll be able to see all kinds of stuff we've got.
Yeah, and we'll also have up there PDFs that James and Dan Krieger are contributing as well to create what we hope to be a kind of a quarterly version of the, we used to have a publication called La Vista, which was sort of irregular. It came out maybe every year or every other year or maybe every decade. But we're hoping to do this now on a much more frequent basis and call attention to specific places within the community. The next one we have planned already will be in March. The Carnegie lectures like this one are held every 3 months, the first Friday of the month where the seasons change. And so that's December. It'll be again March, June, September, and then again in December of 2021. And in March of 21, we will have a Carnegie lecture featuring Pete Kelly. You'll all get invitations to that too. Pete Kelly is a former member of our board and has authored a number of books on local history here. His latest book is about a tragic, rather sordid incident in the 1850s in front of the mission. There was no Mission Plaza then, of course, but in front of the mission, 5 men were hanged without due process of law by people involved with the Vigilance Committee at the time. Pete's book is called The Quick and the Dead. He's going to tell that story. It's possible, it's conceivable we could have a live lecture in the amphitheater at Mission Plaza with social distancing, but we're just going to have to play it by ear. We might do another Zoom lecture like this one. I think this has worked really well, by the way, and I'm glad we've had 60 people at even more, I think, at peak here. And I really want to thank Dan and James. Jim Braybeck, you've been terrific here, and I'm thankful that we got the story about George Aki, as well as so many of the people from the Japanese American community and the African American community and property owners here. Look forward to seeing many of you this weekend, and the rest of you stay tuned. Please be know that you're always welcome to visit at least our website, if not the museum.
My question is, John, in front of the mission where I walk by, when I see the big numbers of 1772, was that when it was built of that year, or was that the one of when everybody got together?
Dan Krieger can answer that question for you. And Dan, you should know that Rusty lives over on Brizolara Street, which is very close to the original site at the foot of Dana Street, where the mission was founded in 1772.
Right. It's actually the third, Rusty, it's the third location of the mission. The first location, Father Sarah came down from Carmel to here with the military governor, Pedro Fages, and he had only a single priest with him to leave behind to found the mission. And they looked for the place where water was most accessible, and they found a grassy knoll at the confluence of 2 creeks. That's Stenner and San Luis Creek today. And what looked like an ideal location on the 1st of September was underwater the following January. And I remember 1973 when it was underwater. And Jim, you remember 1969 when it was underwater. So that they were flooded out. They moved halfway up the creek, roughly where the Odd Fellows Temple is today on Dana Street. And that was the mission that received the De Anza expedition in 1776. Later that year, just before Christmas, it was burnt down in an Indian raid. Yoko Native Americans from the Central Valley came over to steal horses, and they thought if they set fire to the thatched roof, it would distract the soldados from their horses and they could steal the horses. It didn't work that way. The rule in the Spanish military was just as I learned in the Marine Corps Reserve: you lose your rifle and you're up the creek. I won't name what kind of creek. So they guarded their horses, but let the mission burn down. And then Sarah said, we'll move it further up where it won't flood, and put new clay tile roof on it and fired clay tiles, and it'll be okay. So that date up on the mission represents when it was founded, but not when that building was built.
Okay, my other second question is to you, John. Of the mission where the museum is now, right behind on Broad Street, right on the corner, right across the street from the church, the end of the building of the church.
Yes.
Is that part of one of the original houses where the people opened up that building, that museum?
The museum itself, Thomas can answer the question, because I heard him give the same kind of a talk just a day or two ago about the way in which the Carnegie Library, which is our history center and the museum, came about. And the building that was there was a house there earlier, and it has a great story to tell. Thomas, do you want to take that from here?
Sure. It's or were you asking, Rusty, about the wall there, the old mission wall?
Right across the street from that mission wall, there where the museum is now, where the Red Museum is, where where the Christmas parade route that we used to have years and years ago, before the COVID. I keep seeing a reflection off of a mirror, off of a window from that old museum. Is that the lady that founded that whole museum?
I'm not sure. We do have a few photographs on the exterior, showing out from the windows. We've got our displays, inside when you're in the museum, you can see our exhibits, but we have put some photographs on the outside. So I'm not 100% sure which woman you're talking about, but we do have all of the photographs that are in the windows that you can see. Those are all local photographs out of our collection.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Hey, I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Mary. Yeah.
First of all, I've never been to, well, first, a long time hello to Jim Brabeck, who I've known way back when I ran the Bowl-a-thon for Hotline. Good to see you again, Jim. Still doing wonderful community work. I've never been to a Carnegie lecture before, and this is awesome. I'm working on the walking tour guide for the History Center. And so we were there today on these streets, my husband and I, taking some pictures for the guide that we'll have Sunday at the barbecue. But I am also writing, and have been for about 6 years, a play. I used to work at the Little Theater and wrote the legend shows. And I'm writing one about the family of, I went to high school with Sarah Loomis and Tom Ikeda at Arroyo Grande High School. And I'm writing a play sort of in a feeling, it's a Steinbeck feeling. And instead of East of Eden, like Monterey is kind of, or Salinas is, this one, the play I'm writing is called South of Eden. And it's about the Japanese in World War II on the Central Coast. And so I want to get, if I could get Mr. Krieger and Mr. Papp's information, and if anybody has any stories, I would really like to get them, because I need to build the human interest in the play more so. I want some love stories, interracial between Japanese and American white people, so that I can build some kind of a love story in the middle of this play. But I think it's so important to tell the story of what happened to the local Japanese community. It's horrific. And how people like the Loomises, took care of their land, so that when they came back, and if I've got this right, I hope I have it right, they let the Japanese friends use their farming equipment from nighttime until dawn, and they farmed by lantern, so that the white farmers could have their farm equipment back in the day hours. I sure as hell hope that's the correct story. Have you guys ever heard of that before, that they would trade the farm equipment back and forth?
Gladys Loomis told me that story back about 1979. Vard had just died, I think, in that year. I'd gone to Cal with Sandy Kabasi, the Loomis's daughter, and I think she had told me the story when we were both undergraduates together. So that's about Kaz Ikeda, who was a very close friend of mine, said he didn't know anything about it. And of course, Kaz named one of his children Vard. So, and Vard Loomis Way exists on Ikeda property because of all that they did. But in our writing the narrative about the Ikeda family, I just never was able to confirm that story. It's a wonderful story, and it makes sense. The Loomis family residence, Vard and Gladys residence, had a Fury cross, a Ku Klux Klan cross burnt on their lawn for the assistance they were giving Japanese Americans. They took in Kaz's father, as you probably know, who had had a terrible accident with a tractor and couldn't be moved to the camp. So he lived in the Loomis home. And that the community, Vard was a great asset to the Arroyo Grande community. He was the #1 baseball star at Stanford University in the early 1930s, and he coached all sorts of little league teams and such. And now everyone's mad at him for the aid they're giving the Japanese American community.
Yeah, I'm gonna gather your information from John Ashwell when this is over, because because my play opens with just a light and it's a tractor coming down the stage, and it's a Japanese farmer returning the tractor to the white farmer. But if it's not true, I got to change the beginning of the play.
Well, it's something, you know, some things should be true, even though we can't really confirm them. And that's one of those stories that I think should be true. It's a conjecture, if not a fact. But if you want to stay strictly to the facts. Now, I do know that when the Japanese Americans came back, they had practically no equipment at all, and somehow they had to get their work done. So there is some likelihood that that happened, but it's just I've never been able. I have pretty close relationship with the Hayashis and with Kaz, but neither one of them would confirm that story for me.
It may be, Mary,
Okay.
that there's some evidence of that in the collections at Cal Poly. One of the people who's joined us this evening is Laura Sorvetti, who is one of the collections managers at Cal Poly Special Collections. And she's just sent a message to you about the fact that there may be some things there. So you can get in touch with her. I'll connect you too. And maybe there's somebody else who could confirm that story for us. Because whether or not it's true, it'd make a great entrance to the play, I think.
Well, I think South of Eden is a good name for it. And I think it, you know, I'm very adamant of telling these stories, especially because my buddy, Tom Ikeda, is still around, as we all know. And it's just important. And looking at that area today, that little tiny neighborhood really touched my heart. And we're going to work real hard to wrap this walking tour up and get it out so everybody can walk around. It's a tiny little area, but it's fascinating. And the park is just a lovely little park. And I agree that the city should help. I hope the city would help keep it up because it's really sweet.
One of the things that we also should understand is that there is a proposal on the books in the city called the Mid-Higuera Enhancement Plan. And James, I would disagree a little bit. It doesn't call for wholesale clearance in this area, but it does have several references to the need to preserve its history. And we're going to see to it that they do. We're going to hold their feet to the fire that history is preserved there. But one of the elements of that plan is to invest in 3 new bicycle bridges and a bicycle path that would extend on both sides of San Luis Obispo Creek, on the east side initially, then the west side, and then come back across the creek at South Street, right in this neighborhood, and then bend around on Brook Street and come right in front of the current St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church. Sabrina, you want to chime in on that?
Well, I don't remember the year exactly that we had a meeting that they wanted to enhance Higuera Street. And the 2 things that they're not taking into consideration is, one, the historical factor, and the other one is that that creek is known to flood. And I don't see how they're not going to take my property, I'll tell you that.
Oh, no.
But I don't see how if they want to access through South Street and down Brook Street, and I'm assuming you're talking about when the Caltrans property is no longer Caltrans.
Right.
I don't know how they think they're going to do that.
It's it's one of the items that you'll see in the walking guide, the walking tour guide. I have been in touch with the city's bicycle planner, Adam Fukushima, to address the fact that it still is on the books. As to whether it will ever be built, who knows? But it would only be built in conjunction with a project being conducted by the County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. Zone 9 has been accumulating money for many years, working on an environmental impact report to actually widen the creek at that point. It wouldn't be a big widening. It would certainly not take your property, Sabrina. It would have to involve some acquisitions of right-of-way upstream around Bianchi Lane in particular, and the Madonna property and a few others would need to be purchased in order to acquire right of way to construct a wider creek channel. It's a very complicated project. It'll be very expensive, but the resource value of having a bicycle path coming through there could be, among other things, to bring more attention to that park. One of the problems the park has right now is, frankly, that so few people know about it. It's really off the beaten path. And I guess maybe that's an advantage as well, though. And it is certainly one of the most tranquil and I think mindful places to go in the city of San Luis Obispo, as you well know.
Well, one of the problems that I have with actually the city is that they're not, because they're not maintaining it according to their agreements, but it has opened it up to the people that live in the creek. And the people, as we know, we have a problem right under Madonna Road in the creek with the encampments that are there. And I know that they are cleaning them up, and over time they do. However, that park, as I had mentioned to you this week, is still a meeting place, especially on weekends, for the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And the church, and I think Jim Brabeck, I think you got involved in this when we wanted to fence off the creek in that area to deter the people coming out of the creek and settling in Eto Park. I don't know where it's gone, because it seems like I was hitting my head against a stone wall for so many years. It is better. The problem is still existing, but it breaks my heart that Eto Park is not used as it was designed to be, and that is a very peaceful, tranquil place to go and sit and meditate. I don't know. I think this is not the time, but we should get together and make a strategy and address some of these problems.
Well, this is as good a time as any to get something going. Go ahead, James.
I mean, we've gone on too long tonight, but it's so inspiring to me that the people on Brook Street, Eto Street, care about it so much. And I will take issue with John. The Mid-Higuera plan just says, oh, we're going to replace all of this stuff. The people in the area don't seem to be too happy about it, but
no,
that's the plan. I didn't write it. But I think it's so important that we're not just talking about something that's past, but we're talking about how the future is going to look as well.
Exactly.
So
that's where I'm coming from. The future has to be maintained.
If I might make one suggestion for everybody who's interested in Eto Park and the Brook Street neighborhood and historic preservation generally, the city has a schedule for their goal setting. They do this every December, January, right after the biennial elections. And that goal setting process, I took part in them all the time. I was on the city council for 8 years, and historic preservation always gets short shrift, and it's unfortunate. But there is often, if enough people come to the council, and we'll have to do it by Zoom, just as we're doing now, in the next few months, a few weeks. We've only got a few weeks. I would point you to an article by Council Member Andy Pease in yesterday's Tribune, inviting us to participate in that. And there's no better opportunity than right now to raise these concerns and make sure the city knows we want to make this a priority. So enough said.
If you need volunteers, John, for this barbecue that you guys are having tomorrow, I'm interested.
Excellent. Thank you, Rusty. I think we're pretty well covered, but I'll nail that down. I'll be one of the many things I've got to do on my checklist tomorrow to get ready for the barbecue. We have 200 meal packages being prepared and ready to be distributed, and they're all spoken for, unfortunately. So if any of you still on this Zoom call are interested in doing it, please stay tuned for the next Carnegie lecture. I think we're going to want to have another, maybe not a barbecue, maybe a taco thing or something for Mission plaza to talk about the Vigilance Committee and that hanging that took place and the evidence that Pete Kelly's going to. I'm really looking forward to that.
Hey, John.
I'm looking forward to this weekend. Yeah, Mary.
One thing we still have going on is our online auction.
Oh, thank
If you folks are looking for Christmas presents, go to historycenterslow.org and click on the online auction. There's some great stuff on there.
There really is.
It's going to be open for a couple weeks still.
Just one more week through December.
Gotta get
through
my
a week
plugs in.
One more week.
Yeah.
December 11th, it closes. Thanks for reminding me. And I want to maybe turn it back to Thomas, and because I know we've had Dan and James talking here for 2 hours, and we've got a lot of good questions and input, but it might be time to allow people to maybe have one more question, or maybe not. It's up to.
Yeah, I'm seeing James calling the timeout signal. So thank you all for
about to run out of juice.
Thank you for once again making the Carnegie Lecture a phenomenal success. We'll be sure to let you know about the next. Please do check out historycenterslo.org for more information. And here's the dirty part. We're a nonprofit. If you like this kind of content, if you like hearing this, if you like seeing this brought to your attention, and you can, please consider making a donation. It would mean a whole lot. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And until next time, have a great night. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Thomas. Well done. Really well done,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody. That was great. Thank you,
Thank you,
Dan,
Jim.
James.
And Andre.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Good night, John
Several
Boy.
members of our board here, and
Good
it's
to
all
see
been
you.
terrific. We'll see you again
Thank
soon,
you,
folks.
everybody.
See you
Bye-bye.
this week.